Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Good morning. There we go. I think I got all my buttons pushed now. Good morning. It's good to have everyone here this morning at the Sitka Church of Christ. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 24. And Matthew chapter 24 is one of those books that often gets a lot of attention. Whether that's good or bad is for you to decide, but Matthew chapter 24. Does anybody, is it just me, but does anybody still get those random crazy prophecy newsletters in the mail? Oftentimes they come at the beginning of the year and they're talking about the last year's events and how all these things fit together like puzzle pieces, and that's how we're going to know that the end is coming, right? Am I the only one that still gets those? So there's people who look at headlines, and there's people who look at events in the world, and they try to arrange them like puzzle pieces, right? And so that they can figure out when the end of the world and Jesus' second coming is going to be, right? That's many people's approach to world events and the Bible, that it's some sort of code, that it's some sort of symbol system, and that the Bible is this decoder ring like you used to get in the cereal box, that if you just look at everything based on the code on this ring, that it's going to predict every event that's going to happen in the United States, especially in the White House in 2022 or whatever year it is. And that if you love Jesus, right, the Bible is this wonderful thing that predicts all these things. And if you love Jesus, and if you love Jesus in your family, you will forward this email to everyone else too, right? I still get those crazy newsletters that try and predict the end of the world. And so a lot of what they base their predictions on is here in Matthew 24. And so let's see this morning the message that Jesus is trying to get across in this particular context. Let's see what Jesus meant with these words as he's trying to sit in the reality of the world that was around him in the first century, and how he understood the Hebrew Scriptures. Let's see how he understood the Hebrew Scriptures. Let's see what the reality around him was. And let's look at how he viewed the great day of the Lord and God's divine justice, right? That's going to be brought on every nation, and especially the nation that was around him. And so this morning I want to look at what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus, a faithful follower of Jesus in the midst of a crazy world. I'm probably going to regret this because I was just listening to a friend of mine who gave a lesson in 2015, and he was talking about how crazy things were because things were ramping up for the election, right, in 2016. Yeah, he didn't live through 2020, did he? Right? This morning, I want to look at what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus in the middle of a crazy world, one that is constantly in fear of war, of rumors of wars, and global pandemics. What does Jesus want me to be and do in a world that is full of fear of those things? What mindset am I supposed to cultivate? And Jesus explains exactly what that mindset is here in Matthew 24 in the context of his prediction of the downfall of Jerusalem, and especially the temple here, the temple there in Jerusalem. So at the very center of all these predictions and all these instructions, let me say them that way, all these instructions for how the disciples are supposed to conduct themselves is this pastoral message, right? The core of this chapter is not on this particular date or whatever, this is going to happen. At the core of this chapter is Jesus' instructions for how his disciples are supposed to conduct themselves in a crazy world. So we're looking at Matthew 24 today. Let me turn there. Sorry, I didn't have it already open. Still in my Bible class in Isaiah. So we're looking at Matthew 24, but first let's read from the end of Matthew chapter 23. Let me back up and start in verse 34. Therefore, behold, I am sending the prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all of these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The narrator of the story here, Matthew, right, has been following Jesus and telling us how Jesus is spreading the good news of this upside-down value system of a kingdom where he is the king, right? He's just in the past few days, he's rode into town like a king. He's asserted his authority as king over the temple. And what do the leaders of the city, and especially the temple, think of all this, right? They think he's a punk. And so they set into motion this plan to kill him. And so with tears in his eyes, it says in Mark or Luke, it says in verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. By calling Israel to be this new and different way, by calling Israel to be a new people of God in the world, not to respond to the Roman oppression, not to respond with violence or revolt, but with radical generosity, right? This is what Jesus is calling them to do. He's calling them to respond with forgiveness and kindness and peacemaking. And he says that is how the kingdom of God will come, is through these different acts. And they rejected him. They rejected that message. And so Jesus makes this prediction here at the end of chapter 23. And Jesus has tried to call Israel to back off of this collision course with Rome, right? But the leadership of Israel has refused. They've made the same choice that all kingdoms in the world face when they are threatened by an enemy, right? What's the choice that we make? Well, most often is we annihilate them. We kill them. If they're their enemy, if they're my enemy, I need to kill them. That's what humans do, right? And so Jesus is telling them to respond differently. The way of the kingdom, according to Jesus, is loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. So Jesus predicts their downfall, Israel's downfall. He says that you of Israel have refused to gather to me. And so you, Israel, will be destroyed. There's 3 questions, mainly 2, that are answered here in this chapter. And it's important that we understand what they are so that we can understand Jesus' response in this chapter. Verse 1. And Jesus came out of the temple. As he was going away, his disciples came up and pointed out the temple buildings to him. Why would they point out the temple buildings to him? Well, he just explained how the temple was going to be left desolate. And they're saying, hey, Jesus, it's not so desolate right now. It's really beautiful. I have this picture, you can't see it here on the slide behind me, but I have this picture from my office that I moved into the main area here so everybody could see. And it's a picture taken from the vantage point of the Mount of Olives, pointing back towards the Temple Mount, which now has the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on top of it now. And it's hard to grasp the scale, though, of these stones. The stones that built the temple originally were massive. We're talking 8 to 10 feet wide and anywhere from 4 to 8 feet wide. And some of them close to 40 feet long. These are massive, massive stones. And so what Jesus says in verse 2 is dumbfounding. Verse 2, he says to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another which will not be torn down. They have rejected Jesus' way of peace, and he says that as a consequence of that, the temple of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. These are treasonous words for somebody from Judah to say these things, right? We cannot underestimate the impact that this statement must have had on these people. And so naturally, the disciples are going to have some questions. Oh, hold on. There's going to be 3 questions, in fact, and let's read them in verse 3. Tell us when these things will be. When will these things happen? That's the first question. What things are we talking about? The destruction of the temple, those stones that are not left on the other. When are those things going to happen? When is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So there's 3 questions, and this is important to remember as we keep looking through chapter 24 here, and remembering these questions will help keep us on track. And so the first question is, it's important to remember that we keep these questions on track. So the first question is, when will these things happen? When will what happen? It's what he's talking about, the destruction of the temple in verse 2. He's talked about it twice now. And so they naturally ask him, when is this going to happen? And the second question is, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so you see, in the disciples' mind, these people, his closest disciples had been following them this whole time. They're going to come up to him, and in their mind, what's going on? These 2 events were connected, right? The destruction of the temple and the coming of the end of the age. Jesus has just predicted the fall of Jerusalem for rejecting God's kingdom, but along with that is this messianic hope, right, from the Hebrew Scriptures that the Messiah would come and confront evil in the world and bring justice and peace and a hope in a new creation and a rebirth in the universe. And this is their ultimate hope as Jews, right? They're not necessarily hoping in a disembodied existence in some other spiritual realm. They're hoping for a rebirth of the universe. And so in their mind, these events are tied together for them, right? So if Jesus is king and he has been rejected by Jerusalem, he's predicted that the city is going to be destroyed. So when are you going to take up your kingdom and become king of the world, is what they're asking. So they've asked 2 questions, and lucky for us, Jesus answers their questions. That sounds great, right? So which one do you think he answers first? Well, it only makes sense that he answers the first one first. Unfortunately, this is not what a large portion of denominations believe. And so this morning, I really want to get into the text here, Matthew chapter 24, and starting in verse 4, because we read verse 3. Verse 3 was, "And he was sitting down on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?' And Jesus answered and said to them," so Jesus is answering their question, is what he says. Jesus' answer is going to go through verse 35, where we see that there's a pretty clear break in the text, and he starts answering the second question. Let me read verses 33 and 34 real quick, so we can see the transition. "Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door," or "it is near," depends on what translation you have. "Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." What are these things? What are these things? What are these things that are going to take place? Remember the question that they just asked him. When will these things happen? Jesus is going to give us an abbreviated timeline for the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't give specifics, but he says during this generation. That's semi-specific. Right? Jerusalem was destroyed about 37 years later. Very similar, to the 40 years spent in the wilderness, right? When it says that this generation will have to pass away before they can enter the land. And so, it was 40 years from the beginning of his ministry to when Jerusalem fell. And so Jesus is going to take up the second question of what the sign of his coming would be, and of the conclusion, that is the end of the age, when heaven and earth meet and the kingdom of God is put into its final form. And he starts that answer in verse 36, and look how it begins in verse 36. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." What does Jesus say? Essentially, he says, I don't know. What question is he answering with, I don't know? He's answering the question of the timing of his second coming. There won't be any signs because no one knows. And so he's very clear about the timing of the first question. Right? It's going to be during this generation. But about his return and the end of the age, he says, I don't know. Right? So to make things simple, today we're only going to look at the first question, and that is in verses 4 through 8. So ultimately, this chapter 24, is not about creating timelines. There is some time information given. Most of it is just in when you see various different events, don't be worried about them. So that means that they're not in the timeline. When you see this specific event that we're going to call the abomination of desolation, then you need to be worried and you need to get out, and you need to get out now. So ultimately, this chapter is not about creating timelines or speculation. This is practical pastoral wisdom and guidance, right? About how on earth you are supposed to live when the world gets out of control, right? The mindset that we need to have is not necessarily apathy, like, oh, don't worry about all those things, nothing's going to happen. And our mindset does not necessarily need to be obsession, looking for every single way that every single world event fits together as a puzzle. And I have this decoder ring which says Bible on it right here, and then I can look through that ring and I can see the answer to everything. That's not it either. So what are we supposed to do? That's what Jesus is moving towards in his answer here. And like a good Jewish prophet, and like the prophets that were before him, he's going to use language which at first seems very foreign to us here in the 21st century in Western culture. And the fancy religious name for this is apocalyptic literature, right? Apocalyptic, doesn't it all point to the end of the world? I know when you hear the word apocalypse, you think end times, you think of movies with lots of fire and brimstone and the end of the world happening. That's not what the word apocalyptic means. Apocalyptic simply means to reveal something. And so it's something very profound that is revealed, but it does not have to be the end of the world. And so it's a way that the Jewish prophets spoke in a way that was full of imagery and full of symbolism. And what they would do is they would look at events that were close to them in history, that were right outside their door, like the fall of Jerusalem or the fall of Babylon, and they would paint it with poetry that shows its place inside of the cosmic purpose that God has for this world, right? God's cosmic purpose of judging evil to bring peace to all nations. And wondering if this is about the fall of Jerusalem or the end of the world, if you have that question, the answer is yes. Yes, because you're reading Jewish apocalyptic literature. But remember the question that he's answering. The primary question that he's answering is, when will these things be? When will Jerusalem fall? And these things will happen in how long? This generation, or 40 years. And so what's Jesus' advice? Verse 6. He says, not in verse 20, chapter 25. Let's try chapter 24. Verse 6. And you will be hearing of wars and rumor of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. That is not yet the end. Not yet the end. So the whole point of these first four verses, or verses 4 through 8, is that these events have to happen, but that isn't the end yet. I have a handy-dandy chart. If anybody wants one, just send me an email, sitkachurch@gmail.com, and I'll get you a copy of it. It uses all of the time language in the chapter, and it puts it into a nice little chart form, and then it goes verse by verse. And verse 4 through 8 are talking about the preliminary events, but they're not supposed to be taken as signs of the end, right? Verse 6, it's not yet the end. Verse 8, it's only the beginning of the labor pains. And so now in verses 9 through 14, Jesus is going to move on, and he's going to encourage his disciples to stand firm. And he does this by continuing to answer that original question, which is what? This is going to get old. When will these things be? When will Jerusalem fall? So, let's look at the slide here. We need to stand firm in difficult times. There's three main things Jesus is telling them: that persecution is going to increase from outside, even to the point of martyrdom, even to the point of killing you. People are going to hate you. It's going to come from all nations, not just Jerusalem, not just Israel. Believers are going to fall away and betray their brothers. So there's going to be pressure from the outside. There's going to be pressure from the inside. These believers who are falling away and betraying each other. There's going to be false prophets who are going to rise up from their midst and are going to mislead people. And then the saddest one, Christians' love will grow cold because they love God not. Because they do not love God, lawlessness will increase. He has just accused the Pharisees of lawlessness. And so when you think of lawlessness, don't think of looting and shooting in the streets. Think of not loving God. That's what the definition of lawlessness here is that Jesus is working off of. But you who endures to the end will be saved. So there's external threats, internal threats, and at number 3, apathy due to lawlessness. As we humans, right, ever since the Garden of Eden, we've tried to reshape evil into good and good into evil. And Jesus says that is lawlessness. Then, at the very end of this section, in verse 14, he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations. Then the end shall come." Think about the book of Acts. Think about the book of Acts. It gives the account of this time period Jesus is talking about, right? As the disciples go out into all the nations and they are declaring the gospel of the kingdom, right? How do people react? How do people react to that gospel? Well, the poor and the marginalized and the outcasts are the ones that most readily are accepting that message of the good news of Jesus in his kingdom. And the elite of the ruling power structures of the day are the ones that feel most threatened by that gospel message because it requires them to not blackmail their brother, to not extort their brother, to not steal from their brother. So the gospel had spread so far by the end of Acts that by the time Paul writes Colossians, right, when he's imprisoned the first time, he says that the gospel has already been preached to all of creation in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23. The gospel already has been preached to all of creation. Now, we talked about this quite a bit in the class, but let me bring it up here for completion's sake. When it says all the world, does that mean every single person in the world? Well, if we're looking at this with Western Enlightenment glasses on, we would make sure that's every single person. And then we would debate on whether that included unborn babies or not. But that's not the idea of what is being said here. That's not the idea. World in their mindset was the known world. It didn't include China. It didn't include these other places. And so, for some to have their love grow cold is a major judgment on them. What is meant? What is the meaning of life for Jesus? What is the meaning of life for Jesus? What does he say? What is the summation of the law? What is the meaning of life? Love. Love for God and love for your neighbor. And so our purpose as human beings becomes secondary when we look at the rise and fall of nations, right? When they only see their neighbor as an enemy to annihilate, that becomes a problem. Your humanity has become secondary. Love is not in you. Love for your neighbor is not in you, let alone love for God. And this attitude is not unique to only the 40 years that Jesus is talking about here, right? Is it? Does anybody hear echoes of this in the last 100 years, right? Well, that's how Jewish apocalyptic literature works. Because he's talking about the problems and the solutions that are happening when he sees the event that is close in front of me, but that can also apply into the future. And so what do we see in our own days? We see political candidates. We see religious figures claiming the authority of God, that you need to send me your credit card number so you can be a part of this ministry, and then you'll have this blessing over here, right? That has nothing to do with what the Bible is all about. The Bible is about love for God and loving our neighbor. This is not about worrying about the end times prophecies. This is about Jesus specifically Jesus is speaking specifically about an event that is going to lead up to a specific conclusion, and the fact that that pattern is going to be repeated again and again throughout humanity's history. That is what Jewish apocalyptic literature is all about. And so, as he moves on here, let me read verses 15 and 16. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jesus, right? And it's my understanding that the reason that this is in parentheses in a lot of our Bibles, at the end of verse 15 here, is that this is sort of an editor's note here. It's not necessarily the words of Christ. Matthew is saying here, dear reader, go to the book of Daniel, and what Jesus is going to say to you will only make sense to you after you immerse yourself in Daniel and the prophets and their apocalyptic writings. And so what was the event that spurred Jesus to talk about this? Right? It was the destruction of Jerusalem in verse 2. And what was the question that they asked? When is this going to happen? Right? Verse 3. So let's think about the level of destruction that's going to take place here in Jerusalem. The battle begins in 66 AD, and it ends in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem. If you want to know more about the destruction of Jerusalem, Josephus, the Jewish historian, has a wonderful account of it, saying that it's the worst thing that had ever happened in the history. And he gives a very detailed account of how they literally took each block and pried them off for weeks from the temple until there was not a stone laying on top of another one. When the Roman forces finally overran the city of Jerusalem, they spent weeks levering off those stones. They also burned the city to the ground. They plundered all of the gold and silver from the temple. And Josephus records about how they gave sacrifices to pagan gods on the God of Israel's altar. And Jesus says, when you see these things, you need to run. Right? This cannot be speaking about end times, because this is clearly a local destruction, right? Verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So we get afraid when our world falls apart, right? When our world is falling apart, fear tends to grip us. And Jesus is saying, don't give in to that fear or that speculation. The future is in the Father's hands. We need to stand firm. We need to bear witness to this gospel of the kingdom and not let people prey on our fears. We need to stand firm. All right, let's hit the last section here for today. And this is verses 29 through 31. This is a culmination of all these things. Jesus is saying, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and the end is not yet. That's verse 6. This is only the beginning of the labor pains, verse 8. There's going to be persecution and discouragement during this time, but we need to stand firm. That's the last section we looked at, verses 9 through 14. And then verses 15 through 18 describe the beginning of the end, the abomination of desolation, the destruction, the siege of Jerusalem. But when you see that siege, then do those things. In those days, then those days, then, verses 19, 20, and 21, 22, 23, then, and so this climax sequence that begins at verse 15 comes to its completion here in verses 29 through 31, right? It says immediately after the distress of those days. Immediately after, right? Let me just read verses 29 through 31 real quick. I'm reading from the ESV. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. And then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Wow. This definitely sounds like he's talking about the end of the world and his return, right? Well, that's I would grant you that is possible, but I don't think that is what he's talking about here. Because right after the sentence, Jesus is going to say what's going to happen in the next 40 years. Right? Right after that sentence, he says, during this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Jesus is going to say that this is going to happen. This things that happen, this craziness here with the sun being darkening is going to happen in the next 40 years. And it could be that the sun was actually darkened. I will grant you that. It could be. Or it could be that Jesus is just simply quoting from Isaiah chapter 13, which he is. Let's turn there real quick. Isaiah chapter 13. Verse 10, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be darkened when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Jesus is quoting from Isaiah. What is Isaiah talking about? Isaiah is talking about the fall of Babylon. Verse 1 of chapter 13, the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Jesus is quoting Isaiah to say that Jerusalem has become Babylon. Jerusalem has become Babylon, and it will fall. It could be that Jesus is quoting Isaiah 13 and doesn't mean what most 21st century prophets in America say that it means. Right? Verse 17, let's keep looking. Behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them. Who's the them? Babylon. Who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold, and their bows will mow down the young men, and they will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eyes pity children. Babylon, the most powerful and brutal empire of the world, is going to be destroyed. And in the course of describing the downfall of Babylon, verse 10 happens, and he says that the stars aren't going to shine because they're going to be dissolved. The sun is not going to rise up. Even though it rises up, it's going to be black. Did the sun go away in 539 BC? Did we get some new sun that happened? No. Why? Because this is poetry. That's why. This is not designed to be literal. And so the world, as they knew it, came to an end. The vast majority of the fall of the Babylonian Empire happened within the course of like 2 weeks. There had been wars and other things happening previously, and civil wars and different things. But when the final events happened, the most powerful nation in this world, the most powerful empire in this world, fell in 2 weeks. And Isaiah describes that fall of Babylon as the cosmos dissolving. And Jesus is going to use this very line to describe the fall of Jerusalem in the same terms. And so now look at verse 9 in chapter 13 of Isaiah. Behold, the day of the Lord. That sounds pretty end times-ish. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. Sounds familiar. And he will exterminate sinners from it, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. This is going to be like the end of the world when these things happen, when the empire falls, when Babylon falls. Jesus is going to take up this same language. Jesus takes up the same language here of Isaiah and applies it to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you have become Babylon. So what's the question again that Jesus is answering? When will the temple be destroyed? Apparently, he's not reached the climax of destruction in the last few verses at the end of verse 28. And in the words that are going to follow here in verses 29 through 31 here that I just read, those provide the account of the destruction. It's going to be like the sun isn't shining. It's going to be immediately after this tribulation, this abomination of desolation in the temple itself. When it is desecrated, then the end will come, and it will be like the stars and the sun melting away and being destroyed. And so this specific timeline here that shows up in verse 34 confirms to us that the stars melting away and the sun not shining is going to happen in the generation, the present generation. So in the next 40 years. This is not some end of the world, end times prophecy. This is something that's going to happen immediately. And so Jesus' answer to the disciples' question of when will these things be? And his answer is not a specific date, is it? It's not, oh, when you see this, then you add this, and you subtract this, and plus 7 minus 42. That's not what it is it? He doesn't offer a specific date. He does conclude with a definite time of when these things will take place, right? It's in this generation, within the next 40 years. And so Matthew chapter 24 is not about a specific timeline. Jesus does give a generic timeline, but Matthew 24 is about the being an intentional disciple of Jesus. There will be all sorts of social forces, all sorts of fears that are going to come against us. And they're going to try and distract me. And they're going to try and pull me either towards fear or religious or political extremism into obsession, or they're going to pull me the other way into apathy and not caring. And Jesus is looking for those who will stand firm and follow his teachings, who will love God, who will love their neighbor as themselves. This is mission number 1, right? Notice that Jesus doesn't say, I'm only going to love those who win all of their neighbors over to Christ. He doesn't say that. He says the one who hangs on, the one who just finishes the race, that's the one. So I think that the major point here, I think this is the major point. Let's bring it all together in one sentence. Is Jesus is answering the question of when, but he's also answering the question of how he wants his disciples to live in a world that is constantly on the edge of crisis, that is constantly on the verge of crisis, and that constantly feels like it's falling apart. And this is what was going on in the next 40 years after Christ lived. But do those things happen in our day? Does 2020 feel like the nation was being pulled apart? right? Or were we constantly on the verge of crisis? Does it constantly feel like things are falling apart? We have a global pandemic going on. We had a contentious presidency race, right? And the bottom line is that Jesus wants us to trust him, that history is in his hands, that his death and his resurrection mean that the most powerful forces of evil don't get the last word in his world. Because one day, Jesus will return and confront evil, and that's next week's topic in verses 36 through 51. It's good to have everybody here this morning to look at Matthew chapter 24. If you're ready to make that commitment to Jesus, that you want to be a member of his kingdom, you can be added today if you're willing. If you're willing to give up your life right now and make a commitment to let Jesus lead your life, to repent of your sins, to accept Jesus as your king, and to wash away your sins, if you're willing to do that today, we can help you with that. And if you want to have some help with that, you can contact us, sitkachurch@gmail.com, or you can call the phone here at the building. It's good to have everybody this week. We'll see you all next week with the second half of Matthew chapter 24.